Hey everybody, my name is Loren Schoenberg and we're back for yet another one of our Benny Goodman sessions as we go session by session through starting in 1934. Now we're into mid-1935. My two friends here are Hal Smith, who's with us from Arkansas. Give us a wave there, Hal. And Nick from California. And, I'm in New York, but I thought, maybe we could just talk about a moment exactly where we are on the map, because I know there are going to be fan clubs pretty soon, the untold people listening. So, Hal, exactly where in Arkansas are you?
The town I live in is Searcy, and it's between Little Rock and Memphis.
Is that like Miss Searcy's gin?
No, I live in a dry county. There's no gin here.
Okay, all right. We're referring to, of course, a famous Louis Armstrong record where he refers to Miss Searcy's gin. We're not advocating the use of alcohol. How sweet it is. Mm. Nick, California. Where in California are you?
I live in San Francisco, California, specifically the Mission District, right in the heart of San Francisco.
All right. I'm in New York. I'm in the Bronx, and I'm in a part of the Bronx that's known as Spuyten Duyvil, sometimes known as Riverdale, but it's Bronx, New York, and I'm proud of it. I don't care what anybody says. In terms of an overview of how we got here, we started with Benny Goodman and his Music Hall Orchestra in 1934. It was the first time that Benny became a full-time band leader. I mean, he was still doing some studio work. He had led a band earlier on at the Woodmanston Inn in 1933, I guess, for Russ Columbo. He had done various gigs, but he was going to form a band, and they were going to record, and they were going to say what he wanted to say. So that began in 1934. I guess it was August 16th, if I'm not mistaken here. And I should say, we've mentioned it before, that these shows are not discographical in nature. There are people who know a lot more about that than we do, and about specific aspects of the band's history. We're approaching it for the most part from a musical angle and venturing off into these things. Well, it was August 16th, 1934. Benny Goodman and his Music Hall Orchestra, they recorded for Columbia Records. We went session by session, including a few sessions that were done under someone else's name. They've started now recording for Victor Records. But what we're listening to is a session done for transcription, which means that back in those days, if you look at 78 record labels from the 30s, the earlier 30s especially, it'll say, not for radio play or something like that. There had not been an agreement between the record companies and the publishers and radio, and that's what eventually led to big problems later on in the decade. So to play music on the radio, bands would go into the studio and record these transcription discs, which for the most part were 16-inch discs. You play them back at 33 1/3, believe it or not, and sometimes even slower. And a band would get a chance to record a lot of their repertoire. They were not sold to the public, and they were very rare amongst collectors for many years until they were eventually issued. Benny Goodman's band played at Billy Rose's Music Hall in 34. They started the Let's Dance radio series in, I think it was December 1st, 1934, and did gigs to fill in, little gigs here and there, but they were by no means very successful. The Let's Dance radio series enhanced their profile. They got a gig at the home of Guy Lombardo, which was New York's Roosevelt Hotel, and they bombed. And it was just at the time that the Let's Dance series ended in late May 1935 that they go in there. And, the way the story is told is that, just imagine Franklin Pangborn, running up to the band that are going, Mrs. Throttlebottom can't sleep while the band is playing. And so the band lost the gig pretty soon. They made their first sessions for Victor Records and some hot jazz records. And I'm just surmising that maybe when they did these 51 titles in one day, that they had a chance to play out and play some of that jazz that they really wanted to play every night on the gig. Now I'm wondering if we can go to Hal and Nick, and if you can just kind of summarize from your vantage point where we went with the drum chair and the guitar chair to bring us up to this session.
Sure. We started off listening to a lot of George Van Epps, who is a legend among guitar players and other instrumentalists for that matter. George was a brilliant technician and theoretician in terms of developing a codified approach to the instrument very early on. and he's also known as a mentor to many jazz guitar players that came after him. George, if anything, was perhaps a little bit too polite on a lot of these sides. You know, we heard pretty good examples of his playing, although the fidelity was not always to his advantage, nor were the arrangements. But especially once Gene Krupa came into the band, which Hal's going to talk about, there was definitely a bit of a shift in terms of the kind of power center of the rhythm section, and it started sounding a little lopsided. So fortunately for Benny and for us music fans, George got a better gig at the time, which was working with the Ray Noble Band in the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center. So he left Benny's band, but in his place, he recommended who he called his prize pupil at the time, who was Alan Roos, only 2 years younger than George, but in a very short amount of time seems to have adopted and adapted and absorbed George's technique and approach, and in many ways took it to the kind of logical next step. So by the time of this summer of 35 that we're listening to these sessions, Alan Roos is in the guitar chair, being heard to great advantage and really adding to the overall rhythm section feel.
And the drumming we heard earlier was by Sammy Weiss, very, very fine drummer who'd played with the Gene Cardos Orchestra and Dick Robertson's orchestra, very good hot dance bands. And he sounded great in the Goodman organization. I think he was tending to stick with the stock arrangements pretty much. Most of what I can tell, he was playing press rolls, probably 2-beat on the bass drum, and cymbal crashes where they're indicated in the arrangement. Once in a while he let loose a little bit, but not too much. But very good timekeeping, but nothing like Gene Krupa, who really changed the whole feel of the rhythm section. And I must say it's for the better. He brought with him all his knowledge of the New Orleans masters and the Chicago style, and used all of it to great advantage with Benny Goodman. He drew attention to himself. He just made the rhythm section sound a lot more dynamic than it had before.
So let's go to the personnel of this record date, June 6, 1935. Goodman on the clarinet, the trumpets, Pee Wee Irwin, Ralph Musillo, and Russ Connor's Bible, his discographies say Jerry Neary or Nate Casebeer. But Hal, if I'm not mistaken, you ID'd Nate Casebeer on a solo.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we can definitely put that in there. The trombones, led by Jack Lacey, Red Ballard in his customary second trombone chair. The reeds, Toots Mondello and Jaime Schertzer on the altos, Dick Clark and Art Rollini on the tenors. And there are other woodwinds in there. There's bass clarinet, there's flute. And in an interview I did with Toots Mondello shortly in 1992, he talked about how he really didn't play flute with Goodman until 1939 and the Bolero. So someone else is playing the flute there, unless Toots got his stuff confused. Frank Froba, piano, Alan Roos on the guitar, Harry Goodman on the bass. We'll be talking about Harry Goodman in a moment. And Gene Krupa on the drums. And it's worth noting that Gene Krupa turned 26 that year, and Alan Roos turned 20. And I think it's very important, for the folks who are listening with us, that that we don't have, that we get rid of kind of like the old black and white photograph, or the thought of Mon Pa Kettle listening. Well, I don't think that Mon Pa Kettle would have listened to these records, but some old folks in the movie way back when, listening, and it was music of young, vital people. And that's who was playing the music. And I think that really has to be stressed as we try and get into it, not backward looking, but forward looking. So let's go to the first track. It's Yes, We Have No Bananas, and it was arranged by Spud Murphy. Well, that was Yes, We Have No Bananas, and I'll tell you something. I mean, just for starters, that arrangement by Spud Murphy, it's very funny. You know, it almost starts like a hotel band or a stock arrangement, very much on the beat. Ba, bum, 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 bum. And you listen to it and you say, oh, boy, that's a good band, but I don't know how interesting it's going to be musically. And then in the second chorus, man, that rhythm section goes like this, and you got Benny Goodman playing a typically brilliant clarinet solo, and we're off into Jazzville, and just a record, you know, for all time. And from that point on, even the writing, the Spud Murphy's arrangement, gets jazzier. The beautiful tenor solo by Art Rollini, who was obviously a featured soloist in the early days of the band. And when I read his autobiography, I think he, you know, didn't like the way that things went, that he got less to play and some of the other sidemen got less to play. In the early days, it was shared more. And when you listen to the early air checks of the Goodman Band, you can hear a lot more Art Rollini in there. Man, he sounds great. Pee Wee Irwin on a trumpet solo. And then the arrangement kind of ends hot. And I'm wondering, like, maybe that's one way to start to think about the Spud Murphy arrangements, or some of them, is that they were written, and as I've mentioned before, I've seen the scores. He writes the date, he writes the name of everybody in the band. So he's writing for the specific gigs they were playing at the time. And it's possible that Benny said, man, I need some charts for the Hotel Roosevelt or for the Let's Dance gig that sound kind of commercialish at the beginning. So they don't change the dial, and then let's give it to them. So that's an opening gambit on this particular record. But I'm fascinated as to what you guys heard of all that, and also of the guitar and drums.
Well, to pick up the baton, Loren, you know, what I really enjoyed most about this side were those solos. They were it was really interesting to hear the different chairs, have an opportunity to stretch out a little bit. And all the soloists were top notch across the board, including Benny, of course. From a guitar perspective, I had a couple observations. First of all, you know, Alan Roos, kind of when people talk about him now, they often quickly remark how he emphasized the backbeat, the 2 and 4, which he certainly did. On many records, and certainly was part of his sound, but he, you know, was equally capable and was certainly a great 4/4 player in being able to really just to put a driving quarter note beat together and shift back and forth between the two. And again, you know, a lot of this becomes more and more formalized as the 1930s progressed. And by the end of the decade, you know, you really heard rhythm guitar players in these large bands playing 4/4 pretty much all the time. But on these kind of earlier records, you can hear the shifts and the subtle shifts between slight 2 feels and slight 4 feels in the guitar chair, in conjunction with the rest of the rhythm section. Mm-hmm. The other thing I noted about this record that I wanted to bring up was how much the guitar sounds like a drum at times. And this is something that I hope we'll talk a little bit more about as we progress. But, you know, it's important to remember that the guitar at this point in time was an unamplified instrument. It was an acoustic instrument. And it had certain properties that amplification and electrification would take away from it. And one of those properties was the ability to sound like another drum. And not as explicit as pounding on a drum, but having some of the same timbre that you know, some of the Gene's kit had. And at times on this record, you can hear that pretty clearly, which is, again, kind of an exciting component of these early swing records.
There's a lot to say about the drumming on this side, but I'd also like to point out that once again, Harry Goodman is a hero in the rhythm section.
Absolutely.
The big full sound, and generally playing in 2/4 rather than the 4/4 you might expect on a hot arrangement like that. But he keeps it moving forward and leaves plenty of space for the other people in the rhythm section to have their say. But really marvelous sound that he got on this. I couldn't hear very much of Frank Froba, but that's okay because we heard a lot of Gene Krupa. and that makes me happy. I think with one exception, this side really lets us hear Gene Krupa playing like Gene Krupa and not like Baby Dodds or Chick Webb or someone else. He played very, very crisp press rolls that became one of his trademarks, and rim shots in places you wouldn't expect to hear them, and hi-hat on the last chorus to give it a little extra heat, and backed off a little bit, went back to the press rolls and went out on the hi-hat. And the thing that harkens back to New Orleans was behind Benny, he played what sounded to me like Tim-Tims. Those are small, thick cymbals that are mounted on the bass drum rim on the player's side. Baby Dodds and Zutty Singleton and Ray Baduke all had those. They have kind of a jingly sound as opposed to a crash cymbal or a larger cymbal. It's almost like you took the jingles out of a tambourine and mounted them on a bass drum and played them with a stick. Gene used that to good effect behind Jess Stacy on a recording from this same year called The World's Waiting for the Sunrise.
Well, I'll tell you what, you excited me with that thing about the Tinta. I mean, if you guys don't mind, why don't we just listen to that record now? And, and again, that's something I really dig about the series is, we stay pretty much, the discography is guiding us, but we can go off on certain things. I mean, I remember in the last episode, I forget which tune it was, but we're in the middle of discussing, one of the real hotel band arrangements that they recorded. And somehow it went off to about 15 minutes down some highway off of that record. And it was really, really great. So, I urge, those of folks who are following, don't be put off by the tunes we're talking about sometimes, if you know what I mean. Or if it's a record you think who wants to hear, three old guys. Well, talk about an old record. Anyway, let's hear that record now.
All right. that was this session was under Jess Stacy's name. That was Jess on the piano, the great Israel Crosby on string bass from Fletcher Henderson's band, and of course Gene Krupa on drums. And Gene was using his sticks on those large, not large, thick, small cymbals mounted to the bass drum rim, and getting kind of a jingly sound on one chorus behind the piano.
Yeah, let's give a shout out to Israel Crosby on that side. It was 16 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. It sounds utterly amazing on that record.
Yep.
Yeah. Actually, and I think he was still with Albert Hammond's Rhythm Kings. I'm not sure if he'd actually gone to Fletcher Henderson. He was just about to go to Fletcher Henderson right at this moment. And have you seen those pictures of him in the ads for the basso guitar?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
What the hell is that?
That didn't really catch on, did it?
No. The early stick bass.
Well, it goes back. It goes back a few decades earlier where there were these mandolin orchestras.
Yes.
And they started making stringed instruments, plucked stringed instruments, kind of all different sizes and covering the entire range of the musical staff. And they, the predecessor is the mando bass, which is a mandolin, bass-sized mandolin. So they kind of did it again by this time because guitars were so popular that they tried to make this essentially an upright guitar. And again, it didn't catch on. It was very much a gimmick. What we're seeing, the reason for that is we're seeing the size of these bands grow during this period. And already there is a concern with the string bass, for example, and the guitar as well, of just being heard. Not only being heard by the audience members, but being heard by the other musicians on the stand. Where we're going to see it in the guitar, within a year or so, guitar sizes start increasing. And eventually, this leads to amplification of the bass, amplification of the guitar. But still, at this point in time, instrument makers and musicians are trying to figure out, what the heck were they trying to do here?
It's funny. Few people remark upon the fact that there are ads for Freddie Green playing an electric guitar. In the early 1940s, at least he endorsed one. I don't think he ever.
Gosh.
I've never heard it, but I know I've seen an ad for it. They're
Wow.
trying to get people, and also in the photos, we did a series at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem on James Reese Europe, and I put together this thing. And in the band that he had at those Carnegie Hall concerts in 1913-15, they had these I'll say unusual 8 versions of these lyre guitars with like 2 or 3 different finger
Fingerboards.
things. Yeah, I mean, fascinating stuff. Absolutely fascinating.
We should mention a couple other things about Israel Crosby while he's getting his shout out. We're going to hear from him again in Gene Krupa's first recording session under his own name with sidemen from the Goodman Band. And a number of years later, he played with, for me, one of the great Goodman small combos at Basin Street East with Charlie Shavers and Mel Powell and Steve Jordan and Maury Feld. And I wish there was more of that band on record. That's a fantastic session.
Yeah. And also, he also records with Charlie Christian. Charlie Christian's only a session on the acoustic guitar. And then, as he's most known to jazz musicians, for his great work with the Ahmad Jamal Trio, and one record with George Shearing's trio with Vernell and Israel Crosby, which is very interesting. But as long as we're down Israel Crosby Avenue here, something that frustrates me, because at one point I did and I think some of it might be up on somewhere on the internet, but I did a bunch of interviews with Vernell Fournier, and he talks about Israel Crosby. And I went and I tried to listen to pretty much every Israel Crosby record. And up until the Ahmad Jamal records, he's under-recorded. He's under-recorded, except on the Albert Hammond's Celeste Quartet or Edmund Hall's Celeste Quartet, the Blue Note session from 41. Well, when you hear him, for instance, on the keynote sessions, he's on the famous session with Roy Eldridge, Joe Thomas, and Emmett Berry, or many, many other records, he's under-recorded. I mean, consistently. And it's, I think he's also on some Blue Note sessions with Sid Catlett. He's on at least one, right? And I'll be damned. Compared to John Simmons or the other bass players who were on those sessions, you know, I don't know what it was.
Well, at least you got to play out with Jess Stacy. Those are amazing. What you played on those. Wow.
And very well recorded. And he plays great on all these record sessions. I guess I'm just talking from the oral perspective of actually being able to hear him. All right, let's move on. And at this point, you know, let's go to Rose Room. Another, I believe, Spud Murphy arrangement, and this one, I can tell you from the beginning to the end, is about as commercial stockish as we're ever going to get with the Goodman Band. But because it's the Goodman Band, there's a lot to dig into. Well, I have to say, in defense of that, as all the negative qualities that I ascribed to it before we heard it, of course, it's a beautiful arrangement for its style and what it's supposed to accomplish, which is a standard commercial big band arrangement of the early 30s. And it's played so exquisitely. And again, to the most, to the person who has the hardest problem understanding what that could do for let's say, a jazz musician of 2020, there's so much you can learn from it. The blending, the phrasing, the intonation, the precision of the rhythm section, there's a lot to savor there in that kind of silly arrangement. So let's... That was unnecessary. I don't know why I do those things.
I don't know, Loren. I think that was so square it was hip. I think it's one of those situations,
Right.
It crossed back over. Well, and to your point, Loren, I think what struck me about this recording was just, it almost goes without saying, but how professionally it was executed. There's the same level, they imbued the same level of musicianship into that arrangement than they did on the one we heard before. So it kind of speaks to the nature of what these musicians were doing back then. This was a very serious job in that, they got to let their hair down and play jazz, often, but a lot of times they played arrangements like this. It was part of the gig. And I liked it. I'm kind of a geek, I guess, but I really enjoyed hearing something that is very much of its time, and hearing the Benny's band play it. And of course there was, from a guitarist perspective, there are a lot of little nice touches in there from Alan Roos. Again, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool George Van Epps fanatic, but it's just such a thrill to hear the guitar so clearly on these sides. And that is largely due to Alan Roos and his artistry and his personal touch on the instrument and his kind of interpretation of the George Van Epps approach. So that was great.
He seemed to be emphasizing the backbeat more on that particular track too, and it was easier to hear it because Gene backed off so much on the drums. He was playing basically the role of Sammy Weiss there, just play what was called for and don't cut loose. I noticed he went from brushes to press rolls just to pep it up a little bit towards the end, but Gene stayed in check throughout that entire performance. And again, as you said, that's being professional. Whatever you might want to do to jazz it up, he didn't do it. He just he went with the flow. It was interesting to hear Frank Froba's little spotlight there. Thought it might turn into something that sounded like a precursor of Jess Stacy, but really sounded more like Zinke Cohn or one of those oddball Chicago pianists who followed Earl Hines, and playing kind of a single note style in the right hand, but more florid than Jess or Joe Sullivan or someone like that. More like a novelty piano style, but definitely out of Earl Hines' influence. It was nice to hear.
Yeah. I've got a surprise for you guys. Let's listen to the Goodman Band in 1937 play the same chart. Now, we're doing a little bit of time travel here, but it'll be interesting to see how they deal. Now, and also, at the end, I think there were two baritone saxes because both the alto players doubled on baritone, and the baritone has the lead, but then it sounds like another baritone while that lead is ending, another baritone comes in and plays. So that would be another indication of the heavier texture of what hotel bands in those days with the tenor lead and Freddie Martin and all that. It would kind of give it that kind of, sound. So I'm curious to see what the Goodman Band does with it when they were already the greatest swing band in the land or whatever they were called in those days. And anyway, here it is. Well, that was a rarity. That's the Goodman Band in 1937 playing that arrangement. That's the band Harry James and Jess Stacy and the whole band. I'll just make a couple of comments before I turn it over to you guys, because there was a lot of great guitar and an interesting moment or two there from the percussion section. Now I love the arrangement. Okay, and and especially in some of those kind of weird contrary motion moments, with the harmony, they really kind of get kind of far out there, especially that very end before it goes. The band plays the heck out of it. Jess Stacy on the piano in space of Frank Froba, and someone twist my elbow. Go ahead, twist it. Somebody twist it. Okay, all right. I was right. My surmise about the two baritones, because you can hear that the tenors play the baritone melody, and it's Art Rollini and then Vito Musso. So it was on two different chairs. So hooray for me. But that was, God, what an interesting recording. All right, somebody take it.
Well, I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit here, and this is the most kind of Eddie Sauter-ish type sound that we've heard on any kind of Benny Goodman chart yet. I mean, it gives a little sneak peek to some of those things that Eddie Sauter would do with the band, and I think that was a little more explicit in the second recording, which it's funny. Like, the tempo picked up slightly, and the tempo straightened out slightly. So you heard a lot more just straight time from the guitar, a lot more 4/4. And with that little lift in tempo and that kind of straightening out of the beat to give it much more of that kind of classic swing feel, it really, I feel like it really showed off the arrangement to a greater advantage. And, you heard some of that, that contrary motion and some of those sections that were, kind of slightly different from these other arrangements we've been listening to. In addition to that, there were some great moments from Alan Roos playing those arpeggiated figures we've talked a little bit about before, that we certainly heard on the early recordings that Van Ept was a part of. So we kind of know from those records that they were the rhythm guitarist, part of the rhythm guitarist tool bag at the time. But on an arrangement like this, there was a little more space for Alan to assert himself, and he did so impeccably. I mean, there's a couple moments where you think like, wait, are the two guitars going on? Because he just doesn't break his stride, and he's able to bounce between a really clean arpeggio that's in great time and a strict rhythm figure. So that was, I dug it.
I think even though this still had a dance band-like feel to it, it was jazzier than the previous version we heard, mainly because of Jess Stacy, right on top, under the ensemble, playing those trumpet piano style figures that he played, a single note in the right hand, and acting almost like an equal partner with the horns to state that melody. Gene Krupa played basically the same way he did on the earlier arrangements, starting with brushes and then switching to press rolls. He let it out a little bit at the end of the piano solo with some rim shots, just like he was commenting, he was approving what Jess had just played by hitting a couple of rim shots. And the piano playing is just fabulous. What a wonderful addition to the orchestra that was. That really made it for me. That rhythm section can't be beat.
Well, and note too that the guitar drops out under Jess, or at least reduces the volume to a point where it's very much just an underpinning. I mentioned that before, that you'll often hear that on Teddy Wilson records too. A lot of times, pianists that really had a fully formed two-hand approach, particularly when it came to their solo time, would prefer that. It's, at least we can infer that they preferred that, as oftentimes the guitar will drop out on these records. And again, it's looking at what a contemporary big band guitar player or what someone in a large ensemble can draw from these records that's a great example of, you don't always have to be playing, that, you know, you're there for a primary function, but there's kind of a time and place for everything. And it, you know, sometimes the best thing to do is not play at all. Stumped Loren. Uh-oh.
Point.
Loren.
No. I don't
Oh,
know.
yeah.
I'm just
That worried me.
making the point that you were making. So it's better not to play at all. So I think, you know, we could just have a whole segment like this, you know. Okay. Now,
Okay.
It'll probably be our most popular segment too.
right. We, you know, yeah. I mean, you know, I think I'm going to get a request, you know, after this for talks, if I can bring a mic with a mute button, you know. But one other thing is, just going off on your point, Nick, is about, you know, which when it comes to composition and arrangement, sometimes, you know, like with a big band, you'll. I'm trying to remember what it was. I think maybe it was a Harry Rosenthal session, and even though I had seen it, I hadn't thought about it. And Hal mentioned, right, that there were no trumpets on it. I remember it was the trombones and the saxophones, and that when people write for big bands, sometimes write for any ensemble, somehow they think they have to write for every instrument. Just because you have 8 brass, why not write a whole piece of music for 1 trumpet and a trombone? I mean, you know, and in terms of the rhythm section, and also in terms of what Hal was talking about, going from 2 to 4, it seems like, you know, once you commit to 4/4, then you're there, and going back to 2 is going to seem as either a surrender or the tune is going out, and somehow if you can keep that vacillation going, but the anticipation. That's kind of more exciting, I think. And that's something that's certainly gone out of the music for a long time.
It's more dynamic.
Right, yeah. Well, now we go from Spud Murphy's Rose Room to a Fletcher Henderson arrangement. And even though Goodman did record it commercially for Victor in 1938, it's still, I think, one of the most obscure. I doubt many even Goodman fans can really sing the arrangement. He didn't play it often. And here it is, I Never Knew. We just heard two versions of I Never Knew, and we didn't warn you that we were going to hear two before we heard it. We heard the Thesaurus Rhythm Making session from June 35, and then we heard a broadcast version of the band in mid-1938 with Dave Tuff on drums. And I thought these two comparisons between the two Rose Rooms and the two I Never Knews might be interesting. So the floor is open, whoever would like to take it.
What did you think about Ben Heller's playing on that second one there, Nick?
I liked it. I thought he was a solid player. I was kind of transfixed by not only the arrangement but also by Dave Tuff's drumming. Oh, yeah. That I wasn't too fixated on the guitar, but I think Heller was a solid player. I think his biggest fault was that he came in right after Alan Roos. And I think, much like many players that came in after Alan Roos, they're always judged by the standard of,
by not being Alan Roos.
Exactly. And as we've kind of talked about before, during this whole period, there were many different ways to approach the rhythm guitar chair. And Alan was one train of thought kind of taken to its ultimate, if you will. And there were certainly a lot of other very effective and very good different kind of ways to approach it. What I really loved about this record or this recording or this chart was the chart. I thought it was just so interesting how much Fletcher Henderson had reharmonized such a well-known tune and at such an early point of jazz history. I mean, I think a lot of us, certainly myself, often tends to think of 1935 still as kind of early, if you will, but it's really taking a lot of chances with what to do with the melody of I Never Knew, which wasn't that old at that point in time. I think it was first published in 29 or 30. But it was certainly known, and there had been plenty of recordings by this time. And what Fletcher did with it was just amazing. And you really do get a sense, I think, of why those arrangements were so appreciated by the Goodman fans, and why they were so important to Benny's success. When he left the kind of womb of New York City, if you will, and ventured out and eventually made it out here to the west coast of California, and then started just really hitting it big. So it was great to hear it in two different versions, and great to hear Dave Tuff, a surprise guest appearance by Dave Tuff.
I knew those cymbal splashes right away. I knew that was him. What a contrast between the earlier version, although that was a slower tempo, and it sounded to me like Gene Krupa was basically sticking to the arrangement on that, even down to the cymbal accents that he played. He played the same ones twice, and that indicates to me it's probably off the arrangement and not something he came up with, whereas Dave Tuff just played them where he felt they ought to go. And at a brighter tempo like that, you're not as likely to step on a trumpet hit or a sax figure if you improvise a little bit on the drum part. Also interesting, the timekeeping by 1938 had basically gone from the snare drum to the hi-hat, in keeping with what Count Basie and other forward-looking bands of the day were doing in the drum section. Most of that, from what I could hear, was played on the hi-hat with just cymbal crashes for accents, or a little bit of press rolls on the snare drum from Dave Tuff, but not very much. He was making it go a la Joe Jones and Chick Webb in 1938, using the hi-hat and the cymbals as the primary timekeeping devices.
I can't resist. Let's listen to the studio version of I Never Knew It, Dave Tuff, just to nail this down even further and see what happens. And the band, and we'll talk more about the arrangement. And, Nick, I loved your point about the reharmonization, because I can't think off the top of my head, and I'm sure there are a few exceptions. I can't think of another Goodman record up until you get up to the Eddie Sauter stuff, where such a far out reharmonization of a well-known melody occurs. I mean, Fletcher is usually like, oatmeal-ish. I mean, that's the wrong way to put it. Fletcher is usually true to the composer's changes. Yeah, he throws in little, very musical alterations, but for the most part, it's 90% of what the composer laid out, and then he improves it.
Well, it's amazing what tempo can do. It was interesting to hear the slight changes in tempo from version to version, and what tempo can do to either tighten up an arrangement or make it appear or sound like it's a little bit more loose. I think my personal preference was that live version that we heard, or the second version that we heard. Not the least of which is because you could get a little bit better sense of Heller's beat, which was nice and even and kind of chugging along, if you will. The other thing that I was thinking about as we were listening to this slightly later version is I wonder how much input the people that were running the thesaurus sessions had on Benny and their performances. It's kind of important to remind everyone that these records were released somewhat anonymously, right? People would the labels or the disc jockeys would receive these discs, and it wouldn't have Benny Goodman's name anywhere on it. And if you're hip, you could perhaps pick up on the fact that it was Benny playing, but it wasn't necessarily to get Benny Goodman music out there. It was to fill up airspace on these NBC affiliate stations all throughout the United States. So, we hear a pretty polite treatment of this Fletcher Henderson arrangement on the thesaurus transcription. And I do have to wonder, well, how much of that was someone in the studio in a three-piece suit saying, let's keep it polite, boys, and, make the people happy, which is a little bit of surmising, but yeah, there you go.
I don't know if it was that as much as it was an understanding of what the gig was by the band. That, right. In other words, yeah, you're coming in. I mean, And also to your point, Benny wasn't Benny yet. He hadn't had a success with the jazzier versions. So he's coming in to say, this is what my band will play on that one nighter up in New Rochelle or wherever they were, and so be it. But that's a very good point. Now we should backtrack and say we've heard three versions now: the Thesaurus Rhythm Makers one, an air check version, and the studio version from 1938. Those last two, with Dave Tuff on drums. And you know what? I think the trombone soloist, I think this is one of those rare Red Ballard solos, because it definitely doesn't sound like Vernon Brown. And we know that, I think it was on Remember, there's another one where Red Ballard had a solo. And you can always tell because it's not the jazz trombones. You can just tell from the attack at someone else. So I think we can add this to the very small Red Ballard solo discography with Benny Goodman. And just to reiterate something we talked about early on in the show was the great heroes of this band. It's not just Harry James and Gene Krupa and Jess Stacy and Bud Freeman and Vito Musso. George Koenig and Bill DePue and Red Ballard and all the other guys in the band who rarely ever soloed, at least on records. They're equally deserving of the praise that we heap on the hot jazz guys, because without them, the band never could have achieved what it achieved. So, so I think that's a point worth making. Hal, anything left about Dave Tuff? Or?
Yeah, how many programs do you have? No, while I like the wild aspect of what he played on the air check, the studio version let us hear what he was playing more clearly. And he was using one of his signature techniques, which was playing on the hi-hat stem with the cymbals closed, with the right stick playing one pattern on the cymbals, and the left stick alternating between the neck and the tip of the stick, playing triplets and other rhythmic patterns on the hollow stem of the hi-hat. It's unusual to do that with a big band. You think you need more weight behind what you're playing, like open hi-hat or ride cymbal or something like that, but he sure made it work. And it was a very, very tricky pattern that he was playing there, but it didn't detract. It just made things go. You can hear that to really good effect on Opus 1/2 with the Goodman Quartet, where he plays the entire performance on hi-hat, different parts of the hi-hat. No cymbal crashes, nothing else until the very end. But he plays closed, or rolls on the closed cymbal. He plays open and closed hi-hat. He plays on the stem and different patterns on the stem. He was as much a genius on the drums as he was with literature and art. That was just a fantastic performance, utilizing that technique with that big, loud band and still making it work.
All right. Well, let's go back to our fourth. We're doing these in groups of four. So our fourth title today from the Rhythm Makers is Love Dropped In for Tea. Okay. I have a good joke, but not appropriate. Okay. All right. Here we go. Another Spud Murphy arrangement. I love that. I'll tell you something. You know, Spud Murphy arrangement. I guess he's a little bit of a chameleon, in the sense that he, unlike some of the other arrangers for Benny who came in with a point of view. Not to say that he didn't have a point of view, but maybe his role in that band was to just kind of do a whole bunch of different stuff. You know, there's elements there that almost sound like a Fletcher Henderson arrangement. There's elements that sound like some of the more commercial Spud Murphy-ish things. But what a great performance. And again, the thing that just strikes you is, as both of you have remarked upon, is the incredible ensemble playing. I mean, that is perfection. Every note, just a clean shave, or however you want to think of it. It's just absolutely perfect. The brass does something interesting somewhere in the first chorus, kind of an unusual kind of articulation. Art Rollini, and we haven't even mentioned, you know, he's the younger brother of the genius Adrian Rollini, playing a melody solo, but with such a beautiful tone and little extra notes here and there, that he deserves so much more credit than he got. Then Toots Mondello at the end taking a bridge. It sounds as though, because the tenor was so on mic, that like there was a mic that maybe Art was playing into, and Toots is off over there somewhere. Doesn't make a difference. And the tune has some interesting little harmonic things. An amazing thing happened, folks, while we were listening to it, which was that, you know, Hal and I guess we both recorded with Marty Gross, the great guitar player, and I didn't know that you had, Franklin. You probably didn't know that I had either. And there were some little changes in the chords in the first chorus. They're just a little unusual, a little interesting, and I could hear the only person in my brain space that I know who I could hear doing that would be Marty Gross with the guitar across the with "Love Liberty," you know, kind of a little like Fats Waller, like he does, and a lot like Marty Gross. And then Hal said to me while we're listening, he says, "I recorded that with Marty Gross." Absolutely unbelievable. So anyway, those are the nice things and the nice spirit. Marty just had a 90th birthday party, I saw, and a dear friend and a great guy. Anyway, Nick, what you got?
Yeah. Well, speaking of guitars, you know, we heard something a little different from Alan this time out, which was a much more relaxed performance. It didn't have the same crisp attack we've heard even in kind of the slower tempo tunes we've heard Alan on before, which again speaks to what I've been talking about. That there was no one way of doing this, and even within a singular player, you know, they wouldn't necessarily approach a similar tempoed song or a song with the same mood the same way, and just little subtle changes in the way you attack the instrument, the way you're choking the chord or not choking the chord, where you're shifting the syncopation can have a pretty big effect on the overall feel. I like the relaxed feel. It definitely was kind of the most George Van Epsian sounding Alan Roos performance we've heard yet, if I can be super convoluted about the whole thing. But it was just, again, it provided a really nice support for the arrangement and for the soloists, and just made for, I dare say, easy listening.
I think that performance could possibly have gone a little dance band-ish had it not been for the rhythm section. They kept it jazzy all the way through. As you mentioned about Alan Roos, Nick, and Gene Krupa played a lot of press rolls there and kept it from getting that dance band sound. Not over the top jazz, but just jazzy. And the only moment I heard that didn't quite match up was Frank Froba's tremolos. It wasn't like Earl Hines on Apex Blues with Jimmy Noon. It was more like Sparky and his magic piano. It just didn't quite fit what was going on. I noticed Gene used an open crash cymbal on the last bridge. It's kind of unusual to play that and then back off from that and go back to press rolls. But it was a nice effect. It just woke up everything for 8 bars and then went back to the original mood. And he was a real master at doing that kind of thing, just waking up everybody and then being settled again. Really, really liked the drumming on that one.
Yeah. We've come to the close of yet another one of our trips through Benny Goodman, 1935. We're deep into the rhythm makers. Thanks, Hal. Thanks, Nick. I'm Loren, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.